Thank you everyone for joining today. The session we're going to be looking at here is the common D365FO security mistakes and how to avoid them. This is going to be a dual session presented by myself and Andre. If we go ahead and jump into introductions quick, and then we can go ahead and get underway. So first and foremost, I want to go ahead and thank DynamicsCon for having Andre and I today to present this session. Thank you all for joining, and hopefully you're having a great DynamicsCon. There will be a Q&A chat available, so feel free to utilize that throughout the session, and we'll be sure to grab those. To quickly introduce myself, my name is Alex Meyer. I work for a company called FastPath as a Microsoft integration architect. My contact information is there in the middle. I write on a number of educational blogs that I have surrounding all things Dynamics 365 in Azure. I have an D365FO security course. My MVP profile is there as well. A little quick background about myself. I've been working in AX and F&O for the last 7+ years, and I've spoken at a number of different sessions around the United States and Europe on security audit and compliance and best practice in those areas. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce my counterpart, superhero on the security side, Andre.
Thank you, Alex. Well, my name is Arnaud de Calavon, and I'm really happy to do this session at DynamicsCon together with Alex. As for just a joke, I mentioned we are just like twins. We're security twins. We don't look like each other, but our common interest is about the security in Dynamics 365 for finance operations. I work at a company called 2increase, where we make ISV solutions for Dynamics 365 finance and operations standard solutions, but also Business Central. You can find me on LinkedIn, but also I shared some other contact details where you can just drop an email or read more about things I share about Dynamics 365 on my dynamicspedia.com blog website. My background, I was awarded the first time as an MVP for Microsoft in business applications in 2013. So I have now about 8 awards. Very proud of maintaining them, and worked with AX for over 20 years, starting with the version 2.5, where I really started the implementations, but also had a look at the version Axapta 1.0 back in 1998, but skipped the product for several years till I really started working with it. Being involved also in a kind of bit of pre-releases and previews on already the Dynamics 365 FO starting about 8 years ago. And besides my normal work, I'm also a community contributor, answering a lot of questions on the Dynamics community. I do share some of my experiences within blogs, and also just like this DynamicsCon event, I also like to present and teach about the Dynamics 365 solutions.
So before we jump into actually going through the security mistakes, we do want to put this disclaimer up. Andre and I are both security professionals, so anything that we're going to perform here in our demo scenario coming up is done under our close supervision, and we must insist that no one attempt to recreate or reenact any of the activities performed that we are about to perform.
Yeah, you might hurt yourself, so be careful.
And with that, we'll go ahead and jump into our security scenario that we have set up. So let me go ahead and pull this up, and we'll go ahead and set a scenario here in a business far, far away that is running F&O. So,
hi Alex, how's it going? I'm glad to be back at the office.
Yeah, me as well. Andre, it's going well. I just got a security request from upper management. Apparently there's something going wrong with the Alicia user's access. She can't get to vendor bank account set up. So I'm just going to give her sysadmin access so she can go ahead and get vendor payments out the door.
Oh, and is there a lower privilege role you could probably maybe assign her?
You know, there probably is. I'm not really sure how to go and find that, and we're really under crunch time. We really didn't test the business processes that we have in place from a security perspective before going live.
Okay, but did they submit a support ticket for this? And did you get any approval for this change?
Yeah, you know how it is. I just really need to get this done. We don't really have time to go through our normal, ticketing process and approvals.
Okay, but do we know what happened a bit? Did we customize the rules before assigning them to users?
No, I think we're using out-of-the-box rules from Microsoft. Those have to be correct, right?
Wouldn't customizing access for each business process be a better approach? Since security and also user licensing are tied together, probably we could save a lot of money on licensing.
Yeah, I don't know.
Alex, wait. What environment are you now making all these security changes? Shouldn't we go through the normal testing first?
Yeah, you're probably right, but I need to get this in, and we're going to do this straight in production. Well, we really just don't have time.
Okay, but didn't Alicia have this access before? What happened here? I'm getting a bit nervous.
I think she did, but we ended up having to create a custom form for setting up vendor bank accounts, and they just didn't go through and test it.
Okay, and did we create custom security for that customization, or and how did we test it?
Yeah, we didn't create custom security, and the user, when they were doing testing, was probably assigned sysadmin. So we really didn't end up testing security. So, don't worry, I'll come back later and be sure to remove this access, in the future. So now now that this user's assigned the security, we're going to jump forward in time until this company's next audit cycle. So, Andre, I really need your help.
Alex, what's up?
Our internal audit review is coming up, and they want all of our system administrators and what they've done with their access. I think we have too many sysadmins assigned.
Okay, don't we have support tickets for all our sysadmin requests?
Well, we have it for some, but as you probably know, we don't create a ticket every time, especially if the request is coming from upper management or if we're trying to get things out the door. So I'm having to go through emails and post-it notes and try to remember all the times we assign this.
And don't we have a periodic review of assigning the user access?
Yeah, but a lot of managers just blindly approve those and don't really do the actual review of the actual access.
Oh, definitely. It sounds like we made a plenty of security mistakes and we have to take action here.
Absolutely. So, with that scenario, right, hopefully this doesn't sound familiar, but I'm sure a couple of those different points probably did. And, how many different security mistakes did you actually catch going through this? So, if we're jumping back into this, right, the whole session here is about going through and being able to look at the different mistakes that users and end users will make as they go through an implementation or upgrade process from a security standpoint. And so when we start looking at the scenario that we just went through and addressing the mistakes, the first one that we talk about is really utilizing out-of-the-box security, right? You may have, in the scenario, heard me talk about the fact that we were using out-of-the-box roles from Microsoft because they have to be, right? And that's a common sentiment. For those that may not know, if you're going into a new F&O implementation, right, Microsoft does deliver out-of-the-box roles, duties, and privileges, right? So it's very easy to go in and be able to say, well, I'm just going to utilize what Microsoft gives me out of the box, right? That's going to be fast. It's going to be easy to use. The downside of that process is the fact that a lot of the out-of-the-box roles have been developed from a functional standpoint, right? Microsoft likes to show off all the bells and whistles of different areas, and they may not always be done from a security and a compliance and audit perspective, right? So you may be incidentally over-provisioning users access to a particular system, right? And so when you start to over-provision, right, that's going to lead to things like more risk being introduced into the organization and a higher licensing cost. So the fix in this case, right, is to actually create what we call least privilege security. We actually address that here in an upcoming slide. So this is the first mistake that we introduced, I guess, into the scenario that we had from that perspective. So the first mistake leads into the second mistake here, where we talk about user access is over provisioned, right? And this can happen for any number of reasons. But the first and foremost that we hear quite often is that end users can't figure out security, and so they end up just assigning more and more roles until they actually can perform whatever action they're trying to perform in the system. And the reason for this is because security within Dynamics AX and F&O is hard, right? There's no way around it. That's just a fact of the ERP system that we're dealing with. And so there are a number of different resources, and I should mention free resources from people like Andre and myself that, we try to go out and, provide that information on, best practice and different tools and features that you can utilize to help with that process. But the underlying core is that, security is hard, and if you really want to understand it, right, you're gonna have to spend the time and effort to actually, become more knowledgeable in those areas. The big thing is that if you go through and perform your testing correctly, right, to the second point that we have here, you can find a lot of those security mistakes that you may have found, but a lot of the time security testing is not a priority that we have during implementation or upgrade. And so especially if you're dealing with after go live, right, if a user can't perform a particular process, each second, each minute that they don't have that access or that they're waiting on that, right, is money that your organization is potentially losing in that case. And so when you have that relationship there between time and money, that users are waiting on access, right, it's very easy to hear the phrase, just give them the access that they need, right? So, from an upper management perspective, right, if users are just waiting for access, right, they don't really care maybe of the incidental risks that may be introduced from that access being granted, right? They just want to get shipments out the door, or orders being processed, or whatever that process is. And so with users being over provisioned, right, the other thing that we see is that over assignment of the sysadmin role. And so it's very easy, if you want to take it to the extreme, right, instead of users being assigned, multiple roles, sometimes they'll just go in and be assigned the sysadmin role, right? And it's very easy to go ahead and assign that because users can have access to everything, right? There's not going to be any issue from a security side that they're going to run into. The problem is that once you start assigning that sysadmin role, it's very hard to take it away. It's kind of like trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube, right? It's very difficult to remove that sysadmin role because then you have to try to figure out what this user actually needs from that perspective. And so the other part to this is that you could potentially be increasing the cost and the amount of effort that future audits, either internal or external, will have, because this is the first report that auditors are going to ask for, right? They're going to ask for who's the sysadmin in your organization and what are they doing with that access, right? And so the more users you have to perform those tasks for, the more or the longer time that it will actually take to perform that particular audit, and it will cost your organization in those areas.
Alex,
yeah,
if I may interrupt a bit, it's not only about the internal users who will get over assignment of the system administrator role. What I also see in a lot of implementations is that external consultants helping during the implementation will get the system administrator role assigned in also production environments. This is also something that you see in a real large environment with over 1,700 users and a lot of consultants. In that environment, indeed, there was an over-assignment, and I've seen, including external users, the consultants, it was over 56 users who had the system administrator role. It was really insane.
Yeah, that's a great point. Not only for internal users, external as well, but also the different environments, right? From your dev, test, production, UAT, whatever, QA, right? To know at each level, right, what access the user has to, right? So, and especially it gets difficult when you have users assigned different permissions at different levels, right? To actually be able to accurately test those systems. So absolutely something to keep in mind there. Mistake number 3 that we had was and we kind of mentioned this earlier, was this idea of least privilege not being implemented during the security design. And so what this actually means is least privilege is the methodology by which you will try to assign the least amount of access the user needs to perform their day-to-day operations, right? So the steps for this are actually to determine, well, 1, what steps the user actually need to perform, right? And then 2, actually figuring out the security required to perform those steps, right? So there's a couple different pieces to this to actually implement it correctly. But it really has several benefits, right? And there's 3 main areas that we kind of see. The first is that if you actually are assigning the correct security to the user, you're going to limit the risk that that user could potentially have within your implementation, right? By removing the inadvertent or intentional action of making a change that they shouldn't, right? A lot of the times this is unintentional, right? Or inadvertent, right? It's not something that somebody's going in and intentionally trying to commit fraud, but they may not understand the ramifications of changing a particular setting or configuration value, right? But they have access to it, and so they may go in and make those changes without understanding that. And so if by removing that access, right, you're lowering that risk that the user could introduce into your organization. The second one here is more from a audit and compliance perspective, right? It helps eliminate the user segregation of duty conflicts and then the associated cost of mitigating those, right? So if you have if you're trying to meet internal, external audit requirements, right? And you are having to go through and actually mitigate the segregation duty conflicts for a particular user by lowering the access that user has, right? You're also, in most cases, going to lower the number of conflicts that a user has, and therefore you're also lowering the cost of mitigating those conflicts, right? So by having that user over provisioned, right, you're increasing that time required there. And the final piece is one that we actually, Andre and I talk about quite a bit as well, is the licensing cost of this, right? Because F&O is kind of unique in AX as well in the sense that your security that the user's assigned is directly impacting the license that's required for that user, right? So by changing a user's access, you could also potentially be changing the license that they're required to have. And so it's not, what the user's actually doing in the system that's requiring the license, it's what they could potentially do or what they're assigned to do, right? And so that's where your security and licensing are tied together. And so by lowering the access the user has, again, you could potentially be lowering the license requirements for that user. And so those are the 3 benefits from the implementing least privilege. The cons for this, right, is that it's going to take longer than out-of-the-box rules, right? It's going to take longer to actually go in and set this up to go in and then utilizing the out-of-the-box rules from Microsoft. And so you really need to kind of take a step back and determine what process you're going to utilize. One thing I will note is that you can take like a hybrid approach. Where we have, in my case, I've seen customers that go in and will utilize out-of-the-box roles from Microsoft in certain areas, but then we'll go in and actually design least privilege roles in others, right? So you could go in and around your high-risk areas and actually design least privilege security there where you really care about what users have access to, while going into other areas and maybe utilizing out-of-the-box security layers from Microsoft. So you really need to have a balance between that least privilege and then the least amount of effort, right? So you're probably not going to want to go to the extremes one way or the other. You kind of want to try to find where the best fit is for your organization in between those.
Yeah, you mentioned also the out-of-the-box security rules. We also had in the dialogue the mistake about them. I never recommended to use them because I always call them examples instead of out-of-the-box rules. Mm-hmm. They're just examples, and the only security rule I used out of the box was the system administrator, and all of them were customized to the needs of what was really required for the customers, at least in my implementations.
Yep, absolutely. All right, the next mistake that Andre and I performed, I guess, during our scenario was getting tunnel vision during the security design. You're so worried about getting the user security set up, right, that you may worry about other things that security can impact. And we kind of mentioned this in some previous slides, but designing security without segregation duties or process controls in mind, right, where you're actually going in and just trying to, figure out exactly what this user needs to perform their day-to-day operation, but you may not be thinking about, okay, well, if I assign process A and process B to this user, right, that's going to introduce a risk that we're going to have to address in some way. And so you really have this idea of user versus a position security design, where instead of designing security for the user, you design it for more of a position, and then you can, if a user has to, there's a number of different pros for going the position route, but if you have to cover for somebody else, or if that position, hire somebody else for that position, right, you can assign that security a little bit easier in that way. But the biggest thing here is that we're going to talk about from a segregation duties perspective is that every environment is going to have risks of some kind, right? It's not really feasible to get down to zero risk or to have true segregation duties across your organization because you're going to run out of either time, money, or people to actually do that. And so the idea is that you want to blend security and controls together to effectively meet your needs. And then the other part to this is that you get tunnel vision. You're looking to get exactly what this user needs access to, and you're not really taking in the licensing considerations, right? And so there have been numerous times where, I've seen, I guess, with our customers where, they think that these users need this particular access, but if they were to offload that to another group or another person, right, they could lower the licensing cost for this user. And so if they change their process slightly, right, they could save their company large amounts of money. And so it's just something to keep in mind when you're going through and designing security to also keep that in mind as well. All right, the next mistake that we had was, and you may have heard this mentioned, that we were making security changes directly in production. This is talking about deploying security, but the same process of assigning security as well should not be done directly in a non-dev environment, right? We really want to go through and treat security like it was code. And there are a number of different blog posts about this from other Microsoft personnel and other MVPs about the ALM, or application lifecycle management process, that you should have within your F&O environment, and really your security should also fit into that process. And so you want to go in and make sure that you're treating your security like you would code. So just like you wouldn't let a developer go and make changes directly in a test or production environment, right? You wouldn't want to change security in that way. And so instead of making changes directly in production, we really should be going down and making changes in a development environment, and then code promoting those, or following the same promotion process as your code to go to your dev, UAT, QA, test, right? Whatever those environments are, and then finally to your production. And so that's really the process that we want to follow, and that's going to give us the best way to actually manage this particular code. So with that, I'll go ahead and let Andre take the next couple mistakes here, starting with the no periodic access reviews.
That's correct. Also, during the script, suddenly Alex was worried, we have an audit coming up and I need help. We need to get some information. But actually, one of the issues we see is also that there's no periodic access reviews in implementations. When the security will be assigned or a new person will join the company, they just assign a certain role and don't care about probably users who should have temporary access to the information, like temporary or contract workers. Also, what happens is that people will not look after all kind of users who probably already left the company, and also not the organization or the IT department might not be aware of all position changes. Then they only get just an alert, hey, this person needs now access to be able to enter sales orders, but they don't ask or things like, hey, what is causing this? And he had access to the vendor bank accounts before in his previous position. Does we need to remove that access or not? So if you look at just a normal business, people come, people go. Your business might be a bit changing. So in that way, also the security is not static. The environment is changing, everything is changing. So also you should review if everything would be correct assigned as well. So you should have a review in place, but that should be owned by managers and the business process owners and not IT. If you think of IT, they will only look at the licensing part, meaning that, hey, we still have users in the application consuming licenses, and we need to free up some of them. That's not an IT job. In fact, from the business, there should be a process in place to do it correctly. If you ask IT, they will just create a job and check if the user is still an active user in Azure Active Directory, and will just disable the user without knowing what's the real status or action to be taken. So recommendation would be periodically access or review the access of all the users if it's still correct or not. Then we talk about the mistake number 7. If you upgrade from an older version or another application, just don't copy the security from the things you had before. It's quite easy. If you come within an organization, they say, hey, here's the older system and look what they did. Then give them the rights they had in the old system as well. But it's very common that if you implement Dynamics 365 Finance Operations, and even if the older version was a previous AX version, for sure you might want to update new features in the system, or probably you think of some processes to be a bit different. So you're not only the business processes, but also related to that, the security model might be a bit different. And an example I had in the past is that, for example, on the finance department, employees needed to create the vendors in the system, but in the old system they had an own manual work of submitting purchase orders and do all kind of vendor reviews who could be a new vendor in the company or not. But at the moment the invoice came in, at that time there was a need to create a vendor, so it was at that time logical to create a vendor at the moment it came in. However, when the implementation was done with Dynamics 365, also the purchasing department was onboarded, and so that means that they did now create the new vendors, and only the finance department should check if all details were correct and probably take care of the vendor bank account. So don't copy what you had before. Also look at opportunities. Is there a better way to set up or manage the security itself? We can continue to mistake number 8, and this is really, it's hurting me always, that security is a low priority. Meaning that during the implementation or an upgrade, or even if customizations are done, then they think of what should be able to do in the application. So they will set up some main accounts, start testing with the application, they need a customization, and everything will be done without taking the security into consideration. Then towards the end of the project, then they'll find out, hey, we don't have enough time anymore to do the security setting correctly. And that leads to also just what Alex mentioned before. If we want to do the security with the least privilege correctly, or find the balance in the hybrid approach, you should start thinking of the security already when you also start the implementation project. It's not only security, but also the reporting. If you start too late, there's not that much of time anymore, then you will not do it in the correct way. So at least when you start it, also start thinking of the security, which users are to be taken up in the application when you're live. What roles do they need and what access do they need? Also think of what access or combination of access is not allowed. So think of the segregation of duties and do the proper testing already in the UAT environment with all the roles implemented. That will also ensure that once you go live, that all functionality has been tested, including the correct roles. So there will also not be just like we noticed in our script that Alicia can't maintain the vendor bank accounts anymore, because in the UAT environment we can first test it and get out all the issues before actually go live with the application. Also, what we see is there might be some issues when we install Microsoft updates or probably updates from ISVs or other updates from vendors, that people don't look carefully at the impact of security. There might be new features implemented in the application that might also require security changes, like a new subscription billing, which will come in the new release wave starting April this year. You might need to review the current way of working, but also when you want to implement the new features, you also have to ensure that the security changes will be applied and that users can also in time use those new features. But also what can happen is that Microsoft, but also ISVs, I'm working for one of the ISVs, but I didn't see any issues we created ourselves yet myself. But if I missed something, just send me a message afterwards. Hey Andre, you're wrong. You did something wrong with security with an update. But what I've seen is that sometimes Microsoft is changing the out-of-the-box security roles in the application. But also what they can do is sometimes replace a certain menu item with another menu item for a kind of new enhanced form. And in that case, if you don't look at all the changes or don't test the updates, then you might end up with just a go live of the updates in your production environment, and that, for example, a user can't access a form anymore. So ensure you do an impact analysis and make sure the users will also do a test if they can access all of their objects like they were used to do in the past. And also one of the issues or just examples I noticed in the past, there are also some form control properties where a needed permission is sometimes set, sometimes not. And during various versions, there was just a switch of a needed permission set to no and then again to all. But once you have access to a certain part of the form and Microsoft is changing the needed permission to none, then we also have to change the security settings accordingly when the user should have access to it. So that's it might be sometimes a surprise, but you can prevent yourself from having issues by also reviewing every update from Microsoft and ISVs before you really go live with a new update. This brings us to the last mistake of today, what we want to discuss with you. Implementation of the security without really having the correct knowledge of all the aspects of implementing the security in Microsoft Dynamics 365 for finance and operations. It might be that a person is not really knowledgeable enough and understand every single concept of the security architecture. That could be like there's just a lot of implementations going on and there might be a resource not available, so probably quickly educate a junior and say, hey, this is a role, this is duty, this is privilege, and this is a menu item. But there's more compared to that. And sometimes also the customer just is in control of making all the security changes and they might not get the proper training to look at all the aspects, because next to the menu items, it's also possible to secure the tables and fields individually to make some more granular access, but also already a bit briefly mentioned in the last mistake, some form controls can also have some different requirements for permissions, which sometimes requires also manual settings of those form controls, and they also need to be all managed with the menu item, but all in the same privilege together with the menu item. So also mention the correct access to the tables and the form controls. And also what people sometimes forget is that all the data entities in the application do have individual permissions. So it means that if you try to give access to a certain form, and you also intend that or want to have the user to be able to use the Open Excel functionality, that's not visible unless you also assign data entities as part of the security access. Also what we see is that some features which are really nice and rich features in the application are forgotten or probably ignored. And one of the examples, it's an extensible data security framework. With extensible data security framework, you can manage access to individual records, and that's not only being able to read the data, but also more granularity on when is which user able to make changes to certain data. Both Alex and me did write blogs about the extensible data security, and we will share our blogs also on one of the next slides, so you can read more about this framework also on our blogs. And also one thing to mention is the table permissions framework. This is an additional security on top of sensitive data, tables containing sensitive data like credit card information or the vendor bank account information, managed with an additional property AOS authorization on the tables and also on the fields. If you start with creating new privileges and just assign the menu items, then on runtime you might get an error that you don't have the proper access to tables or individual fields, or you might miss some of those fields. In that case, you also need to grant access to the tables individually, just to ensure that it's intended to have access to that sensitive data. Also, what is an option is creating a kind of date-effective access that's not possible using the configuration utility in the UI, but from Visual Studio, there's an option to manage which access is granted for current, future, or past records. That could be applicable to HR personnel, where probably some least as possible persons should be able to look at private details. So if a certain HR assistant is not allowed to see that much, then probably access to only the current employees, and all the future and past employees are maybe not important to her, and we can also restrict access that she will see only the current ones. And not on this slide, but also related to the security and a bit of the GDPR regulations we have in the European Union. There's also an option to set up which users, or actually users from which roles, are able to look at the private details of users. So phone numbers, address details, etc. And you would also like to limit it only to probably only HR or recruiters in the application. What we also see is sometimes that people think, hey, there are some certain batch jobs which I don't think we really need it. What I've seen in the past is that some batch jobs are deleted where they think, well, I'm not using them. However, the automatic role assignment batch job, if you delete it in AX 2012, it's a hard way to get it back. Luckily, Dynamics 365 is a bit more relaxed in resetting up those batch jobs. But actually, there's also a license minor batch job which is running in AX 2012 and also for Dynamics 365. That's mandatory because with that information, also Microsoft can monitor the compliance if you're compliant with the number of users.
So thanks, Andre, for going through that last slide there and going through the top 10 security mistakes that we see. Like we've mentioned throughout this, Andre and I both have respective blogs that we write on. You can find us at, mine is the MicrosoftCloudBlogs.com. Andre's at DynamicsPedia.com. So you can absolutely find us there. And at this point, we can go ahead and take any questions that you've had, answer those in the chat, or we can do live Q&A. Our Andre and I's contact information is here in the middle. If you want to reach out afterwards. Thank you for all attending, and thanks again to DynamicsCon for having us. Thank you everyone for joining our session today. Andre and I are here to do a live Q&A. Be happy to answer any other questions you guys had. There was some good conversation during the session. But if there's anything else that you guys would like to ask, we're happy to answer those.
Thank you all for attending the session. I'm happy to be here. And to be honest, I still have a bit of pain in my head, but probably we should do another sketch in the front of the session, and not about security mistakes, but about successes that makes me smile instead of hurting my head. Actually, if there's no question now coming, we can probably repeat some of the questions and answers just as a kind of recap. The first question was from Johan, where it was asked, is there a way to create a read-only role that actually works to 99%, and then how to do that?
Yeah, I guess response that I posted was there are two different ways to go about doing that, right? Basically, you can, they'll get you a majority of the way there. There are some unique instances where, there's security done in code or through the database or through data. But the easiest way, right, is to go in and actually assign all the menu items in the system read access, right? That'll at least get you a majority of the way there. So I have two different blog posts, one doing it through the AOT and one doing it through the user interface that you can absolutely look at. I posted the links in the chat. Yeah, I mean, those would, I don't know, Andre, if you have a better way to do it. Those are the two ways that I found from a technical perspective.
Actually, for AX 2012, I also wrote a blog myself about also a certain approach that will also still work in Dynamics 365. But actually, after creating the read-only role, you also have to test certain forms, as there might be some menu buttons on certain forms, which will actually also have access to change data without any permission. So you also have to review those forms as well.
Yeah, there's always an exception, right, Andre?
That's correct. Yes. That's also the question was how to do it for 99%, and
right.
The last percent needs some attention. Probably will only find out once a person finds those buttons. Right. I found two forums in the past. So.
All right. So the next one that we had come in, Andre, was about being able to more easily create a licensing permission report. I think, basically being able to automate the licensing reports or to report on those areas. And I think you and I both are kind of responded to that, that there aren't any out-of-the-box reports that'll get you the detailed information that you probably need. But both Andre and I work for ISVs that have solutions for that with ToIncrease and FastPath. So if you'd like to know more information about that, you can feel free to reach out to one of us and be able to talk you through that a little bit. The next one was that Bobby had a couple of great questions. One was about security prep advice for organizations that are either doing an upgrade or re-implementation. So Andre, what would you recommend to customers that are doing an upgrade, and what would you recommend if they were doing an implementation or re-implementation?
Yes, at least we provide already some comments here. However, if you are upgrading from AX2012, then also the security can be upgraded as part of the code upgrade itself. However, there are new features and probably you want to implement Dynamics 365 a bit different. So also like suggested by Alex, a review and probably just check if everything is in line would be better. And if you are just upgrading or just moving to Dynamics 365, then at least security mistake number 8 was about just not being prepared on that one. Just you start too late. What we then see sometimes is just that people just quickly create roles for individual users and do it in a kind of wrong way just because of the hurry. So having an overview of what type of personas do you have in your environment and then map to desired roles as pre-work would be really recommended. Do you have any additional feedback here, Alex?
Yeah, just the ones that I posted in there as well. It's always a good idea to take a second look at your security processes, right? Your signing of security, your designing of security, and how you implement it. Because during the reimplementation, that's when you can actually, or an upgrade even, that's the best time to make those changes. It's much easier to make them then than it is to make those changes later on. But yeah, great stuff there, Andre. The next one, I guess we had, Andre's had a great question that I'm sure, again, you and I get quite a bit about trying to log all the changes for users and roles, user role assignments, duties and privileges, changes to those. The tough part with that is that you go across both data, right? For like changes to user roles is going to be stored in data, but changes to are in the database, but changes to, for example, roles, duties, and privileges themselves can be done either in the AOT through code or through the user interface and data. So that becomes a little bit more difficult to do. There's the out-of-the-box audit trail for those security changes that are done in the user interface, and then you can look at your source control system for the code changes. But I don't know, Andre, if you have any examples for that quickly. I guess we only have a minute left.
Yeah, we now have only 1 minute left, so there's probably not much of time. However, you can always reach out to or Alex or me via the communities or via email or via our blogs. Just ask any question and we can just try to help you. And just another last question. Can you provide your email? I will do that for Mark. That would be good. So at least thank you for attending the session and hope to see you next time.
Yep. Thanks everybody for attending. Have a great DynamicsCon.